Coming at the end of a 2-day conference, I'm afraid everything important has already been said. So perhaps I will start with the story of my friend Peter, who used to teach in the US and got recruited by the University of Singapore 10 years ago. And to his surprise, when he started on the first day, he was given a thermometer to measure his temperature. And more importantly to today's discussion, he was forced to learn to teach online. And remember, I said this happened 10 years ago, and it was a result of the SARS epidemic in 2002 and 3. Even though that epidemic did not affect Singapore too much, the university decided that just in case, let us plan for the future. Alas, I'm not sure that many universities had emulated that example. A year later, in 2012, the president of Stanford University gave a famous speech where he talked about the incoming tsunami. And even though Stanford is at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, he was not referring to a real tsunami of water, but rather universities in the digital era. And I'm not sure, again, that many people paid attention to his warning. And it took a little virus, COVID-19, to transform all of a sudden the world of higher education. If you think about it, more than 20,000 universities, almost 200 million students have been thrown in the largest higher education experiment in the history of universities. And for many, in many countries, in many institutions, we have to remember that 2 years ago, there was still a profound mistrust against online education. In South Africa, for example, it was prohibited for public universities to teach online, except for UNISA, the distance university, which had the monopoly of online teaching. In Peru, when the first higher education law was promulgated in 2014, it contained, and I still contains today, articles that specifically are against online education. For example, you cannot become the dean of a faculty, let alone a university president, if you have a doctorate that you acquired online. And in many countries, accreditation, quality assurance were two separate operations if you dealt with the royal approach to teaching and learning on campus and to the second class approach, distance education. And many professors would be what I would call, and in fact, I'm just using the term that one of the professors I interviewed for some work I've been doing during the pandemic to observing the impact on universities. They would call themselves digital dinosaurs. No experience, fear of teaching online, or perhaps a disdain towards teaching online, faced with students who are much more adept at this approach. When COVID hits, there is at the beginning this myth of the great equalizer. Afterwards, a virus doesn't discriminate. We know, alas, that this is not true. And let me illustrate that with just one example. These two young ladies on the screen used to go to a very posh college in Pennsylvania. And then when they have to go back home, you can see from the pictures that they go to a very different reality. The one on the left, I'm sure she has a good internet connection. The one on the right is now helping her parents back in Florida. They have a food truck. I'm not sure how many hours she could dedicate to her studies. And I'm not sure whether at home she had a laptop and a decent internet connection. And if she had an internet connection, how many siblings did she have to share it with? So we've seen increasing disparities among countries, within countries, among universities within a given country, and among students. In Africa, for example, Joanne was statistics, out of the 700 universities, most of them have not been able to switch easily to online education. And look at this pensive young student in the Amazonas regions of Colombia, South America. She's lost her internet connection, so what can she do? And I'm reminded of this poor Indian student who last June, in the middle of the end of the year high-stake examination, lost her connection, could not complete the exam, and took her own life afterwards. Now, I usually don't mix politics and my professional work. But if I compare here the Prime Minister of New Zealand, where all to this day we've had 28 deaths by COVID, and the ex-president of the United States, where at the latest count, 713,000 people have died, we can see that leadership makes a big difference in politics, but also in higher education. Leadership of universities under COVID-19 has meant thinking about consequences, caring for the entire university community, having an open and honest communication about what we knew, what we didn't know, seeking early feedback, trying to take corrective actions, delegating, risk planning. That was the purpose of my first anecdote about Singapore, and above all, being flexible. So as we prepare for the post-COVID world, what are we going to do? Go back to the old education model, where the traditional lecture is still the most prominent way of sharing knowledge in many countries? We are obsessed with fixed duration. How many teaching hours every week? How many semesters? How many years of study to be able to graduate? Fixed programs, everybody the same program, as if we all had the same interest, as if we all learned at the same space. This high stake end of year exam. Let me share a picture. I think it's very symbolic. This is a private Turkish university whose name I'm not going to share. For the end of the year exam, they send this mirror that you can see on the bottom right-hand side. 11,000 mirrors to 11,000 students to make sure that they would not cheat during the exam. Always, do we study well only if we're on campus? Is it right to have only one lecturer for one discipline? Or to be a student in just one faculty or just one university? I hope we can move towards a new model, and many universities have already started this route, where we introduce an innovative content and delivery mode, where we have, and you have just mentioned it, aligned assessment. So often we change the curriculum, we change our pedagogy, but we stick to the old evaluation and exam system. New degrees and pathways then can incorporate as well micro-credentials, self-learning, and bundling of education activities, collaborative research, open science, and publications. We need also to have a focus on the MDGs, because we want to make sure our research has high impact. I don't know what I did, but something happened to my slide, and now I cannot move anymore. I predict that the university of the future, rather than looking like a pyramid, where you have a majority of undergrads and then a few postgrad students, will look like this star, where undergraduate students and graduate students will be only a part of the university, but that perhaps more importantly, or at least as important, continuing professional development in a world that is rapidly changing, where professions are changing, where we need lifelong learning and adjustment, upskilling, acquiring new competencies, career change studies, citizenship and life skills, and where we will combine on-campus and online through a hybrid model. We also need a new economic model. stronger and sustained financial commitment of governments, not doing what the government of Ecuador as a result of COVID has done, cut down the budget of higher education by 30%. 2 days ago in Brazil, the parliament announced that they will slash by 90% the research budget of university. Try to diversify funding to avoid overdependence on the state if you're a public university, on households if you're a private university, or on international students in countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Pooling of resources. Even though universities compete, if you are in the same city, sometimes in the same part of the city, why don't you pool academics, scientific infrastructure? Why don't you collaborate more? You can compete better if you collaborate more. Do risk analysis and contingency planning, because sadly, today it's COVID, but for many countries, you have war, civil war, you have natural disasters, and perhaps we'll have another pandemic. And finally, we need a new social model where universities are not committed to research for the sake of research to climb in the rankings, but remember our commitment to equity, to the truth, scientific evidence, to ethics, to trained, honest professionals who will contribute as good citizens, and the social commitment of our university. I think that this cartoon that I'm showing now summarizes very well what we experienced in 2020. We started on the left, everything looked normal, and it went down. And actual education experience was really poor for many people. COVID has exacerbated disparities, but at the same time, it has accelerated innovation. And so we need to have a forward-looking plan for the post-COVID and accept that we now live in a VUCA era, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We have to remember that during COVID, many universities have stepped up with a very positive contribution, doing research, producing medical products. You have medical and nursing students who had not graduated, who went to the front line. Some of them have died, sadly, but universities also have been very good at providing scientific advice to government and the public. And I will finish with this slide. What should be the priorities for the future? Keep the university community safe. I will not name countries or universities, but very often we still see that for ideological reasons, for economic reasons, we have sometimes reopened our campus where it was still not safe. Keep playing a stronger role as scientific advisor for society and government, and prepare the future through a new education and research model, through a new business model, and by doing risk analysis and contingency planning as part of your regular planning. And I will end with this quote from the writer Neil Donald Walsh: life begins at the end of your comfort zone.
And thank you so much, Jamil. Really heartfelt and very honest and very frank presentation there, and so much to take away from, so much to learn. I think you've clearly demonstrated, how life is. While it was very good in one part, it wasn't equal for people. So I have a few questions that I want to add to you, but I also want to see if Zulfikar is nearby. We're going to bring him in a few minutes. So let me get through my questions, then I'll introduce him, because he's minding all of the questions from the audience. And we have, about, 10, 15 minutes on this. So maybe yes, because I have to give him some time as well. So we've only got less than 10. Let me get to it. Now, and I loved your perception, the concept of get away from the pyramid and actually to build a star. And I think even the very visual image of a star for the future of education, I think is very, very exciting, because that's what we should be doing. We should be building, creating stars around the world. That's what education's about. But a lot of your work, when we look at it in higher education, it's also looked at the quality of world-class institutions. When you look at the quality of education, bring us back here to this region here, to MENA for the most part. And where do you see the progress? And, are there still gaps that we need to fill?
Thank you for this question. It's hard to talk in general about each country in the region, and there is a variety of universities within each country. But I think that to assess which universities have emerged and which are struggling, I would like to come back to a very simple model that I developed to explain what makes a world-class university. And I'm talking about three sets of factors: talent, concentration of talent, abundant resources, and adequate governance. And through this very simple prism, we can analyze. I remember when I grew up in Morocco, we were all looking towards the Egyptian university as the model, as the most advanced universities. But sadly, for many of them, because of demographic growth, because of insufficient funding, because of perhaps outdated governance in some of the public institutions. And I'm not talking only of Egypt. I think sadly it's something shared by many public universities in the regions that still have very bureaucratic processes, and where university professors are civil servants, where it doesn't matter too much whether they produce or don't produce. And so we see a shift, and today I think it's clear that some of the leading universities that have really really made progress. We would see some of them in Saudi Arabia, in particular KAUST, or AUC in Cairo, or the universities in the Gulf that are emerging because they have built up their talent, because they are well resourced, and because they have more modern and flexible governance.
Yes, and also I think the government has really put a big focus on education, so that's also encouraging many of the big, private players to make sure that they're here, and with the government help and that cooperation, I think they really, it's the focus that's there, and they're absolutely determined. I think you look particularly at Saudi Arabia and even here in the UAE, and indeed right around the region. So that's good news. But talk to me when you think about higher education, and in a way, is there a way they could introduce more practical methods versus theoretical knowledge, or do they need to do this into the classroom so that students are really well prepared, for the future, but also, to be able to handle environmental, economic, social concepts, different areas of their life, because people have been talking about the holistic strategic thinker that we need to be turning out from education.
Definitely. And if you allow me to pick on one model I see in the US, one institution which is very young, but which I find very revolutionary and exciting. It's called All-in College of Engineering. It was created 15 years ago south of Boston. And imagine the audacity of trying to establish a new college of engineering very few miles away from MIT and Harvard. What characterizes All-in is that imagine a curriculum that is like a triangle, where you have one part is, of course, engineering, but the other part is entrepreneurship, and the third is values, it's humanities. And the way they do that is that they cross-enroll at Babson College for the entrepreneurship part, at Wellesley College for the humanities. And their ideal is to train the engineer of the 21st century, an engineer with a social conscience. And there are no lectures. There is no traditional teaching. Every learning is in group. It's problem-based, solution-based. There is a very strange curriculum, no physics 101. Students learn by doing. And I think that's the extreme of what you were talking about, of having an experiential education. So it was a roundabout answer to your question, but yes, let's make our education close to real life. Let's not wait. I still visit so many faculties of medicine where it's only the 5th year that the student will meet a patient, or faculties of engineering where it's only after a few years that we actually build something. So yes, we need really to modernize and revolutionize the curriculum and the pedagogical approaches.
Yeah, it's so true. And in fact, in Chicago, when I did my journalism degree, I had done a very heavy academic one in Dublin, and then I went to Chicago and I did a degree in journalism. And we went out with cameras and we did real work like we do. And that was one of the first one in Columbia College too, that literally was very experimental. It was great. So, yes, there are some jobs that you're never going to learn a whole lot from the books. You actually have to do. So it's combining both. But talk to me, when we look at the countries, particularly in the global south, and how, we really want to promote equal access to higher education. What advice can you give them, or, who comes on board, who can help? What do they need to do? Because they do want to raise the standards. And I think there's an eagerness for learning there as well.
Equity is a very important, and if you look, in fact, at the top US universities, you can contrast, in the US, you have the Pell Grant, the beneficiaries, students from low-income families. When you look at the proportion of Pell Grant recipients in top universities, Ivy League universities, you will see a very small proportion. And then you have Berkeley that has a much higher proportion. Or you have University of Arizona that has progressed so much, becoming a research-intensive university in the past 15 years without sacrificing their efforts to be inclusive. So I think it has, being selective doesn't mean that you shouldn't, trying to get talent doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to get low-income students. You mentioned at the end of the previous panel that, gender equity. When you think about the waste of half of the population being excluded or having less access, especially in STEM programs, and I think it's a mindset. If you in the US, on average, in engineering education, you have only 25% of female students. All in college has 50%. So you can do it, with the same pipeline of girls if you are open, if you reach out, if you offer scholarships, if you have needs blind admission, and if you make it part of your mission, that you will judge your success not only by the number of papers you publish in Science and Nature, but also how many female scientists do you have, how many leaders, etc.
And also here in the Gulf region, I think, and you look at, the opening up of Saudi Arabia as well, and the encouragement, I think there, are you overall encouraged that there is beginning to be much more inclusion and diversity?
Well, there is, it depends on the institutions. I mentioned KAUST, which is the only institution so far which is co-ed and has made efforts in that respect. So I think that in terms of gender equity, it is important to really open up the avenues. And in fact, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have sent thousands and thousands of both boys and girls, male and female students, to get masters or PhDs in the best universities in the world. And I think if they have the opportunity to develop their institutions, they can thrive. I don't remember the name, but I remember when I visited NYU Abu Dhabi, I was told they were very proud that one of their young graduates had become a minister in the Emirates government.
Yes, indeed. And I think we're beginning to see more and more there. And I think other countries look at what's happening and then go, to put their plans in place and realize that they can do so too. So we hope to see certainly more of that. Now, talk to me, when we look at, and we heard from so many people, that online learning has reduced the cost of education. We look at transportation, infrastructure, all of that too. But what's the potential that you see for, I suppose, permanent online learning? And, can it help bridge the education gap that we're seeing? And again, looking at financial strategy and looking at how people can learn. Talk to me just a little bit about that.
Well, I'm always wary of black and white solutions. So I think, before COVID, as I tried to explain, there was a mistrust towards online learning. And now we're so excited. Oh, we can do so many things, including organizing this conference online. But I think that, there is value also with on-campus education, face-to-face. And I think it's really, we have to take the good sides of both approaches. There are people for which online learning works better. There are people whose personal conditions makes it easier to learn online, and that's why the university like Western Governors University, which was created in 1997, already had so much success because they met a need. They addressed a need, and so I think in fact, my daughter, who teaches in a university in the US, used to offer her class under both modality at the same time. So some of the 30 students would take online, some would take face to face, and that was already acceptable. And I think we'll see more and more of this hybrid and blended approach. Now, some universities have already announced that they would be able to reduce the cost. For example, Southern New Hampshire University, which has been a leader in that area, have cut down the price by 63% by shifting to a higher proportion of online delivery than face-to-face. And each university will have, I think there is no one size fits all, and each university will have to find what the approach that fits its strengths better and the needs of its students.
Now, just in a closing question, what I'd really like to ask you, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, and education is certainly, at the very heart of it, because I think ultimately, we need to see everybody in the world educated. So, as higher education is certainly at the backbone of the SDGs, do you think, where do you think it fits, and where do you think it's moving, and how motivated, our higher education institutions, how motivated are they by making sure that we can get to the SDGs, and particularly see what we can do if they can do it?
As you rightly said, from an equity point of view, that's SDG number 4. Universities have a duty to be inclusive and to reach out. But my proposition is that all 17 SDGs are worth working on, and universities are the best placed institutions to do that through their teaching and their curriculum, through their research, through their engagement with community and society at large. I'm very critical of the rankings usually, but I must say that I was very pleased to see Times Higher Education, and I have no affiliation with them, but they created this impact ranking, which really looks the extent to which universities are working on behalf of the 17 and the SDGs. And it's interesting, if you look, just to name two, University of Manchester, which was number 1 this round, or University of Auckland, which was number 1 the previous year, they publish their, every year they do a self-evaluation of how much they do on behalf of the SDGs. And I think that's very important. As you may know, UNESCO is preparing a world conference on higher education, which has 10 themes. And one of it is about the contribution of universities to the SDGs. And the report is, had the privilege of being part of the task force working on that report. And this is something that will be really at the core of the debate. So that's a very important dimension that universities, and it's going, it's not like a distraction or a diversion. If you want to become more multidisciplinary, you will be more effective towards the various SDGs. And there is so much to do. It's not one, depending on your strengths where you are. For example, one of the SDGs is about water and life under the ocean and in the ocean. Well, if you are in New Zealand next to the ocean, you can do much more than if you are in the middle of the desert. But in the middle, close to the desert, you can do something for sustainable agriculture, for water resources, etc. So there is really, I think it's an exciting new horizon for universities.
It really, really is. And I mean, even, when we look at the concept of, ending energy poverty, this is going to make such a big difference for education We talk about the internet being available. Some people in the world are lucky if there's a candle or a kerosene lamp available. So we have to think on the bigger picture as well. What a great difference that's going to make. And a lot of the research in universities can also help that. I'm going to give you one sort of closing question that I want from you just before you go. We have to wrap this up. And, how optimistic are you that we're on the right track? And are you optimistic that we are on the right track in terms of making sure that we can almost future-proof education and meet the demands for the future?
As you can see, I'm passionate about my work and about higher education, so I have to be optimistic. And when I think that they are, and as tragic as COVID has been in terms of human costs, and it's really has pushed universities and professors to move ahead. And not everybody has done it, and many people have done it reluctantly, but I can see so many positive initiatives. And if we can capitalize on that, and we've seen so much more collaboration among universities across borders. For example, and I finish with this example, internationalization that many universities have embraced as an objective was very elitist, because it implied mainly traveling to other countries. And who could afford to do that? Rich universities or rich kids from different parts of the world. All of the sudden, virtual internationalization, universities have been very inventive, very innovative, and you have mirror classes, you can have a cultural week with your partners. And so I think, and I've seen within universities, professors from different departments or faculties who would before never talk to each other, let alone from different universities, they have helped each other. And so I'm confident that by networking, and I would like to finish by repeating something I mentioned in my presentation, is that we are in a very competitive world. That will not change. But by becoming more collaborative, we are stronger together.
And that is such a lovely, holistic, positive, optimistic note to close this conversation on. So thank you so much, Jamil, Salmi. It's been a joy to have you. It's lovely to have the opportunity to ask you a few questions and to engage with you. And I know our audience got some great value from our conversation and that presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.